Lyssa, deHart, thank you so much for joining us all the way from the States. I know your time is on the late side. We're in the morning here in Singapore. But I met Lyssa, maybe 2 years ago. And I joined one of your courses, and it was so helpful and really inspiring. And since then, we've been in touch. Lyssa also has a podcast herself, which all of you can log into, called the Coaching Studio Podcast. And so it's on Spotify.
It's on everything.
So you can log into that. But just a few other bits for you to know about who Lyssa deHart is she's a master certified coach. She's an author, and that's what we're going to be focused on today because of a recent book she got published around metaphors. She's a curious explorer of what makes human beings tick. She calls herself a recovering therapist, someone who took her love of human stories and transformed it into coaching. And today she helps leaders and coaches around the world discover the power of their own narratives. She weaves neuroscience, metaphors, and deep listening into conversations that spark transformation. As I mentioned, you have a few books, including StoryJacking and Light Up, The Science of Coaching with Metaphors. And as I mentioned earlier, you also host the podcast called the Coaching Studio Podcast. So welcome. I'm thrilled. I'm really thrilled to have you on the show. Anything that you'd like to say about yourself before we launch into metaphors that I've missed, or anything you think it's important for us to know about you?
Yeah, I think probably the only thing you missed is that I'm truly hilarious as a human being. And that's about it. That's the only thing. Yes,
actually you are. Yes, that is a very important point. Very good. Okay, so let's jump right in. I read your book. I love it. And of course, I'm reading it, the book specifically, the metaphors, the light up, and just the transformative impact that metaphors can have in a coaching context. But of course, our listeners, there are people who listen to the podcast who aren't coaches. A lot of them are leaders in organizations. So I'd love to hear how metaphors can help certainly coaches, but also people in the leadership domain work with metaphors. Right? But why don't we just start with this question, which is, what drew you to the world of metaphors in the first place?
It's so interesting because, I mean, most human beings really enjoy metaphorical language. It's, throughout poetry and novels, writers, it's often been sort of the thing that makes writing not just powerful, but it creates an embodied sense of the experience. If we're traveling a really rough road where our brains understand what that means. And so we end up having these embodied experiences. And so I always loved metaphors and analogies. And so those were just things that I loved. As a therapist, I really wasn't paying attention to the metaphorical language that my client was bringing into the conversation. We were all using metaphors. Human beings all tend to use metaphors. There's a caveat to that. There are some people who are very literal in their thinking. They don't use metaphors the same way. And if you bring a metaphor, they may get really confused by it because it isn't literal. It is a figurative way of speaking, a visual way of thinking, a somatic way of thinking, but it is not necessarily a literal, that is a sculpture kind of way of speaking. So for some people, it doesn't work in bringing a metaphor. And so in my early work, I know that my clients and thinkers were bringing metaphors. I was bringing metaphors, and we were having these sort of metaphorical conversations. But honestly, they were just really great, fun conversations. I don't think that they were necessarily, I'm not going to say they weren't useful, but I was not leveraging or using the metaphors that the thinker brought. And I use the word thinker and client pretty interchangeably at this point, and I can explain that if you're curious. But I wasn't really leveraging the metaphors that the thinker was bringing into the conversation. And And it was only when I was coaching for a while that I was doing so many recordings of my interactions with people that I started to go, holy cow, there's just so many ways that somebody is communicating specifically about something that is being described metaphorically. And at that point, I started to get really curious because I was like, well, I would imagine there's something more there than just the use of language. So it was really when I started coaching and listening to coaching recordings that I started to pick up on the fact that this was a thing. Then I started doing the research.
Okay. So before we dive deeper into this, I just want to pause to ensure that the audience has an understanding of what metaphors are, right? Mm-hmm. So I just wonder, could you just give some examples of what are metaphors? You did mention it's a visual analogy of someone's expression, right? But could you give some examples just to get all of us onto the same page?
So a metaphor it comes from a Greek word, which means to describe one thing as another thing. I mean, it's sort of, and I think the simplest way to communicate what a metaphor is it's an idea container. So if I say to you, Tini, I'm going to the store and I want to buy a doormat. You know what I'm talking about. I'm talking about a doormat, right? This is something that I'm going to put in front of my door so that people don't bring dirt in my house. If I say to you, I feel like a doormat, that word has changed. And now there's an owned sense of an experience that I'm having. So there are lyrical metaphors that writers and poets use. The bird flew through the clouds like softness through rain. I don't know. That would be metaphorical language. That is, as we're listening to other people, though, that is not what we're listening for. So it's not just any sort of lyrical, metaphorical language. It's really what we want to be listening to and for our owned metaphors that have a source, which might be a doormat, but a target, which is feeling like I maybe don't have boundaries, or I'm getting walked all over, or people aren't taking me seriously, or whatever the target is for the thinker that we're working with or talking to.
Yeah, that's really powerful. And from a coaching lens, one of the things that you're very, very specific about in your book is to always allow the client to unpack their own metaphor versus me as the coach unpacking it or assessing it through my lens, right? So could you say more about that?
From my perspective, this is about cultural fluency. And so you and I live in different places. We have different cultural experiences as a result of that. So when you bring the metaphor into the conversation, whether I'm your boss, your peer, your friend, your coach, it doesn't matter. When you bring a metaphor into the conversation, say you call me up and you say, Lyssa, I've been having a really rough day. Now, is your day really feeling rough, or is that a metaphor for an experience of roughness, right? From the perspective of creating a coaching conversation, I don't need to ask you, what do you mean when you say you're having a rough day? Because I don't necessarily want your brain to light up on the roughness of it, but I may hear that and I may go, I'm really hearing it's a rough day you're having. How would you like to, where would you like to go in this conversation? So I'm going to acknowledge the rough day. And you might say something to the effect of, I just want some peace for today. Peace at that point becomes another metaphor. It's a state of being. So it's an idea container for a state of being. And so in that regard, as a coach, and I know we're talking to a larger audience, but at that point, I have a sense of where you want to go. I don't need to ask you about the roughness of your day. Can you give me the textures? Where does that roughness live in you? What happens to your brain when it's rough? Because all of that is really kind of going into Boyatzis' work around positive emotional attractors and negative emotional attractors, we really don't want the brain to light up on the negative because we already have a brain that's designed for survival. And people will go down long story arcs about the roughness of the day versus where would you like to be going. And so I think for a lot of conversations, what happens is we find ourselves spinning around in these sort of negative spirals, and we don't know how to get out of them, and they're not that much fun. And if we had a direction, I call it directionality for the conversation, I'm hearing the rough day, what would you prefer instead? The person might say something like peace. We now have an end that we're heading towards. Both of them are metaphorical idea containers. And so I don't know, does that answer the question? I'm not sure I answered the question.
Yeah, no, I think it's yes, it does. And something that you mentioned was attractive to me, which is the impact on the brain. Because what I'm hearing you say is, in my language, I call it the spotlight. Where do I, as a person, direct my spotlight?
Which is a metaphor.
Where do I shine the light, right?
Yeah.
And so what is the neuroscience behind working with metaphors? So what's the impact of metaphors on the brain?
So it's really interesting. There are conceptual metaphors, and we're not going to go into all of them, but this really came out of the work of linguists. And most primarily, Lakoff and Johnson in the 70s started really looking at the fact that people were using metaphors a lot, and they weren't just like for poets and novelists. They were the way people communicate ideas, concepts, experiences, values. We shine a light in different directions, right? So we just use metaphors all the time to express how we're conceptualizing something. And so what they discovered and what I found when I started looking at like the biology and the neuroscience and really the anthropological history of this is that there are 4 conceptual metaphors that have to do with seeing, eating, that have to do with movement, and then with object manipulation. And I think when you think about the human creature that we are, all of us started off as indigenous tribal peoples. There's not one group of people on the planet that started off in what we have today. People have been born into this, but our roots are all, we were moving through environments that were dangerous. Our brain was developed and wired for keeping us alive. And so these brain centers, these structures within the brain that have to do with seeing, that have to do with finding food or eating, that have to do with moving through environments and seeing the tiger from the tall grass, and that have to do with object manipulation. I mean, the fact that we're having this podcast and we're both in our own environments using all of this technology in order to have this conversation, I think we can probably globally agree we are the most object manipulative creature on the planet. We use tools better than anything else on the planet. And so these structures in the brain were developed as we evolved our human capacity, and that started to, and as a result of that, our wiring was set to describe our environment in ways that were meaningful to our experience. So you think about like early languages, not languages, but early writing mechanisms. And the first writing or the first like written communication is art. We have the, cave paintings or people who put their hands up against a wall and blew red ochre or something like that, right?
That's right.
Pretty much every single continent except for Antarctica that I know of, have some of these elements of human experience, and they belong to everybody because every single human culture comes ultimately from this place where we were not the strongest species on the planet and we had to survive. And along the way, our brain became really, it became predictive, but it also wanted to be able to communicate meaning. And meaning is a really hard thing to communicate if I try to do it in an analytical way. But if I tell you, my plate is so full, you have your own experience with an overly full plate. It could be positive or it could be negative, but we have all had that experience of holding a very full plate. So when somebody says to you, my plate is so full, I feel so overwhelmed right now, and I don't know what to do, and I just feel stuck with all this stuff on my plate, they're telling you their experience. And it's aligned with a structure in the brain that has to do with food, but it starts this process of moving through the brain as it's creating meaning and trying to describe what the experience is that human being is having. And a full plate sums it up really nicely. It doesn't have to be like, so I've got 20 things that I'm working on, and they're taking me in a lot of different directions. And I mean, that could take forever for me to explain all that. But if I just say I have a full plate, all of a sudden, the state of being that I'm in.
Yeah. The other thing that's occurring for me is the statement, I have a full plate, right? Or my plate is full. There's a whole piece around culture, because it could be, my plate is full, heavy, linking to your definition, or it could be my plate abundance.
Yes.
My plate is so full, right? And so for me, as I put my coach's lens on, to not jump to conclusions and assume what the client means.
Hugely important.
And for me, it's the culture, right?
Well, and what I'll say is that I've worked with people all over the world at this point. And so in your culture, I'll just ask you the question. A full plate can be abundance, but there's going to be content or context shared around what that full plate is. So somebody will be talking about, like, my plate is so full, and oh my gosh, I have all these amazing choices in front of me. It's like this buffet where I get to choose so many different things. Now, that's telling you something, right? And it doesn't matter the culture. Yep. Or somebody's going to be like, I have been waiting for a really long time to have something on my plate, and now I've got so much stuff on my plate, and I don't know what to do with it all, and I need to determine what's fruitful and what isn't. Again, context is going to tell you something. So I don't know if it's a cultural difference, but I think it is a situational difference for sure. But I think most importantly is that if we're listening to the person that we are talking to, and we're listening not just for the metaphor, but also for the context of how the metaphor is being used, we're going to have a sense of what this person is telling us.
Yeah. Context and interpretation, narrative, right? How's the client in this case organizing themselves around this particular metaphor? This is so juicy. I love this conversation. What if we take it into the context of leadership?
Mm-hmm.
So I know I've been saying, if I put my coach's hat on, but leaders are dealing with this constantly as well, either with their stakeholders or with their teams. Do you have any input into what leaders should be listening for? Is it any different?
I honestly don't know that it's really all that different what they need to be listening for, but it depends also on the kind of leader they are. I think first, listening is really, really important in leadership. I think it's probably an underbilled skill set for leaders, is to really listen to the people who are working for them. It is very easy for a leader to be out of touch with what is happening on the ground in their own organization, because there's such a spread between them and the people doing the actual work. And so listening, what are the things that people are struggling with, or wrestling with, right? These kind of metaphors. But then also, like, what do they see as a way to move forward, right? Again, all metaphorical, but I think also it's using the language of the person that you're talking to. So let's go back to this full plate. Positive or negative, doesn't matter. You say to me, I've got a full plate, and I respond back to you, yeah, it's like carrying a basket of rocks. I've brought in my own context at that point. One, I've made an assumption. My assumption may be right because of the way that you said full plate maybe was more negative versus more positive. Or let's say it was completely wrong. It doesn't matter. What's going to happen in a conversation where I insert a different metaphor that has meaning for me is that I'm going to throw you off your flow, because you have to stop now and go, wait a minute. Is it like a bag of rocks, or is it something different? Like, I'm not sure that it is a bag of rocks. And then you might feel like you need to explain it to me. Lyssa, that's not what I mean. I'm not talking about a bag of rocks. I'm talking about a really full plate. And we're now completely off what the person was actually saying, and we're into a whole nother place. And this really goes back to listening. So if you're a leader and you're not listening to the words and you're not able to reflect back the language that you're hearing being used in a way that's meaningful to the person that you're speaking to, you're going to miss core connections. And at the end of the day, I think it would be safe to say that relationships are fundamental to our capacity to be good leaders, to have a vision that people will follow, right? If nobody in my organization knows me or trusts me or feels listened to by me, why are they going to work hard towards the vision that I have for where I see the organization going? So it's really a bit of a, I don't even think it's a chicken and the egg issue. I think it's really, you have to learn to really listen and be present with people and not replay every word that they're saying. Tini, I heard you say that you really had a full plate and there was just a lot of stuff on it and you're really feeling, excited about it because it's all good stuff. Like you've got kiwis and other kinds of fruit and you've got a little protein and on and on and on. That isn't what we're talking about here. This isn't that kind of listening. But it's just taking that shortcut that the person has said, I heard you have a really full plate and I saw your energy shift. What's going on for you with that full plate? Now all of a sudden you get to tell me even more about it. Right. And it may be one of my children is getting married or graduating from college, or I got a new puppy. If that's a good thing, maybe it's not. I've gotten puppies. It always seems really good until you get them home. And then you're like, oh, can they turn into a dog soon? Right. But I mean, I think it gives us an opportunity to be curious with people. It also gives us a place to really connect on a very deep level of a somatic experience. So another example that I think is really important was, and I write about it in the book, is I was working with a writer from China and they were writing a book and they were talking about needing to find steps. And how many times do we get into conversations and people are like, I need a list and I need steps and I just need actions so that I can get whatever done. And so my response to this need for steps was, as you're talking, I'm hearing steps. Are we on a pathway? I almost see like a path opening up in front of us. And she said, no. In China, we say you cross a river by feeling the stones. And if you've ever walked in a river, they can look really smooth on the surface. And there are rivers that have very smooth, sandy bottoms, but a lot of rivers have slimy, slippery rocks that are all different shapes and all different sizes. And that idea of the kind of careful navigation that needs to happen to cross this river, we don't know how deep it is. We don't know how fast the water is actually moving, but that's a somatic experience. I don't need that person to explain to me this experience they're having, because if I've ever stepped in water ever anywhere, I can have a shared somatic experience with them. And I said to that person, I said, is that what we're doing, crossing a river? And she said, yeah, that is what we're doing. And I said, what is the first rock we need to feel?
That is really interesting.
Because then in that way, I'm using her language completely and authentically and with curiosity. And it led to the imposter syndrome and all the other things that were getting in the way of writing, that fear that so many writers have with that empty white page in front of them. And they're like, I don't know what to write. And so we were able to explore all of that through the lens of walking carefully across a river and feeling these stones. that needed to be felt to move forward.
Yeah. So the question that I was going to ask, but you've already answered it, is the somatics piece, right? And what's fascinating to me about this example you've provided is there's the element of culture, right? What her narrative did for me was I started to see the world through her eyes. And so I'd be curious about, what does it feel like to be navigating these different rocks? Because in my mind, does it feel, is it with trepidation, or is it adventure, or is it safe, or is it exciting, or is it scary? And so all of that is really interesting, right? For her to
It's
unpack.
rich, isn't it? Yeah,
Oh,
there's so
so
much
juicy.
there. And people will give this to you. People will naturally do it. It's the funniest thing. So I have a certification program, and I have coaches who come in and learn how to leverage the metaphors their clients naturally bring into these conversations. And it's so funny because they think, like, what is the metaphor I want to use for my demo today, where I'm the client or thinker? And it never works, because that's not how we use metaphors. We don't necessarily use them purposefully. Like, I need to try and explain it to you. This is my experience. We just are talking about what it is that we're thinking about, and we just naturally use them. So it isn't that's the purview of writers and poets, is the manufactured metaphor. In the world of listening for the metaphors that naturally emerge. And for me, it's the ones that are owned, but also have a source and a target that sounds important. The target, and when people come into coaching, or when people are talking about not making sales numbers or whatever it is that they're bringing up, they're typically going to use metaphors that are pain points. Right? That's just naturally how we do it. We're struggling, we're wrestling, things aren't turning over like we expected them to. We're having a problem calibrating.
Right.
I mean, these are all just metaphors of stuff,
Battling,
right? Battling.
combating.
Oh, and I mean, it's just, we could go on, right? Hamster wheels are abundant. Drinking from fire hoses, most people know what that is, right? So, I mean, they're everywhere. Even things like, I feel like I'm swimming with sharks. I mean, that tells you something about the environment that person feels like they're in. So unless they're like the shark swimming lady, they're not excited about it. And so I think what we do is we demonstrate, going back to this idea of cultural fluency, I think we demonstrate cultural fluency when we use the language of that human being. Because even if you got all my neighbors together, and let's say they all look like me, they don't, but let's just say they do. We all are unique individual cultures of one, because we don't just solely identify with one cultural identity. So just like you're living in Singapore, and I bet if we took the people on your block and we asked them what their cultures are, they're going to be like different values, different belief systems, different colors, different ideas about what's right and wrong, different experiences. If I've had certain experiences, you and I might be more aligned, even though we look different, right? And so it's not that I dismiss cultural differences, because I don't, but I do think that when I'm working with you, you are a culture unique in and of yourself. And so again, going back to this idea of cultural fluency, if I listen to you and use your language in order to ask questions and to demonstrate that I'm really understanding where you're coming from, but also being curious about it and not trying to solve your problem, I think what ends up happening is that you feel heard in a way that we very rarely feel seen and heard by other people.
Very, very interesting. Wow. Are there examples of metaphors? Because you mentioned earlier that usually clients will use metaphors to highlight pain points, right? Are there examples of metaphors that are used to highlight successes or joy or opposite of pain?
Yeah, absolutely. And they can be very obvious and they can be very subtle. I'm going to go back to the doormat. Tini, I feel like a doormat. This is a very owned metaphor. It gives you a state of being. And this is where most coaching conversations start. What do you want to talk about today? I've been having la, 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 whatever, problem. I don't like it there. I feel like a doormat. Excellent. Now we know the starting spot. We have a starting point. In coaching, and honestly, I think this is beneficial in therapy too, we need to have an outcome of where that person wants to go. So I'm not going to ask about the negative, like, oh, I hear you're a doormat. What kind of doormat are you? I don't want to know that. I do not want to go down that road with them. But if you were no longer a doormat, what would have shifted for you? What would be different? And I might say anything. I could use the language of, I would feel peaceful. I would feel confident. I might say, I would feel like a door, because doors open and doors close and you can lock them and you don't have to open them, and you can open them for a while and then shut them. There's a lot more agency in a door. And at that point now, is that what we're doing? Exploring between the doormat and the door? And the client is probably at that point going to say, yeah. And what would you like to, where do we begin this exploration? And they'll tell you, because people tell us the questions that we ask them. And so I think the door in that particular example is positive. I mean, it has a lot of agency and autonomy, and I can be any kind of door I want. Maybe I have a tiny little peephole and I can just kind of peek out. Maybe I have a big peephole and I can open it and like go away and close the peephole. I might have a glass door. I actually do have a glass door, and I can see the person standing there and I can wave at them as I keep the dogs from yelling at them through the door. And so in that regard, becoming a door is super positive. It could be, though, a state of being, like I feel peaceful or calm. I feel confident. I think at that point, if somebody's using a metaphor of confidence, that's the place where we want to dig in. What is the experience of feeling confident? And then they're going to talk about it. You know, my shoulders are looser and I'm standing straighter. I had a person I was working with, and she said, I have a strong back, but a soft belly.
Ooh.
Right?
Nice.
I think that's a beautiful metaphor for that experience of standing in your own sovereignty and agency. But you have also a strong back and a soft belly. I mean, that's a beautiful metaphor. And if you've ever done any kind of yoga or just stood, you've had those moments where you're like, yeah, I feel really comfortable standing here.
It's nice.
And you know what that experience
It's nice.
is.
The strong back piece. It's nice to also invite what would be the visual representation of that. So maybe a mountain or an oak tree or right?
I don't bother with that, honestly, because they've already given you something.
true.
And I don't need them to make a better metaphor. I need to trust the metaphor they've given me has lit up their brain. That had lit up not only her movement brain, but her physicality was completely enlivened in the saying of a strong back and a soft belly. And I think we can acknowledge it, like that's a beautiful vision. What do we need to explore in order to support that you are in that space of the strong back and soft belly? That is much more important than me going, oh, that's like a really strong grounded tree. Right. Again, that's a little like bringing in a basket of rocks for the, for the person who has the other, something else going on, that full plate. We really want to honor the language that the person has already used. If what that person does is we're exploring it, and this happens all the time, people will move from metaphor to metaphor to metaphor. So it may start off with soft belly and strong back or strong spine. And as we're talking about what allows for you to have that strong spine, soft belly, they'll start talking about that stuff. And then what gets in the way of that, and they'll talk about that. And then they may be like, it's not really that. It's that but it's also something else. And they'll use different metaphors. I just flow like water with whatever metaphor the person is bringing up, because I want to follow where their brain is leading. I may touch in with them And how does that flowing river of salmon fit with your soft belly and strong spine? And the thing that has been amazing to me is that if it comes out of their brain, it's connected. Right. And so when you ask that question, they're not like, what? Nothing's connected between my soft belly, strong spine, and the river of salmon. There's no connection. But if it came from them, their brain knows the connections that it made in order to create that particular idea container. And it means something to them. And I think that is fundamentally what's important about listening to people's specific language and the metaphors they use. One, I wasn't kidding when I said, I think I'm hilarious, but I really try and have fun with the people that I'm working with. Talking metaphorically gives us a distance of perspective. We're talking about a full plate. We're not talking about every single one of those things that's on your plate necessarily. What do you want to do with this plate? Oftentimes people want to take one thing off the plate. By the end of the conversation, they may have dumped the whole plate, but they, like success would be if I could take one thing off my plate often. And I'm not saying that full plates are never used for positive, but most people don't go to coaching or to therapy or into difficult conversations sharing the positive. They start off with what isn't working. And so there's a little bit of, and plus the context around it. But I think, so that's one of the reasons why I would just stay with the metaphors they give you and not insert any of your own. Which isn't to say that if you hear something, like the person talking about steps, and I'm like, I'm almost seeing a path open up in front of us. Is this a path? And it's like, no. So you want to be sure that you're also really flexible. And as soon as they go, no, well, then what is it? And this is what it is. Go with that. That then has really anchored in and lit up their brain. Nice.
Let's bring this to a close. It's been really, really interesting for me. What do you think is something that our audience can continue to practice if they want to get better at working with metaphors? What is something that they can continue to practice?
Well, I think the first thing is, and I hear this just consistently, I hear people just don't use that many metaphors, Lyssa. Like my clients don't use metaphors like that, or my family doesn't use metaphors like that. And what I would put a bet on is that if you start listening to the people that you're talking to, all of a sudden you're going to start noticing how many metaphors actually emerge in a conversation. And some people are going to be less metaphorical. And if you're talking to a guy who only uses 12 words a day, you're probably not going to hear a lot of metaphors from him or her or them, whoever that is who only uses 12 words a day. I wouldn't know them because I use way more than 12. But if you're talking to just like your kids or your spouse or your relatives or your mom, and you start listening, you're going to start hearing the metaphors they use all like regularly. And it'll be simple ones like I'm leaning into stuff, or, I need to get moving, or I need to like start taking steps towards, you're going to start hearing the language of metaphors everywhere.
Yeah, I love it. So it's really tuning in and practicing my listening skills.
It really
I love it. Lyssa, thank you so, so much for joining us in today's episode. And to our audience, as we complete this episode, what I'd love for you to continue to work on top of what Lyssa offered, is also start to notice your own metaphors. Start to listen to yourself and what are some of the metaphors you use? And if you were to unpack that, what is the message that your brain, or what are the connections of your brain, and what is it trying to communicate as well? And that can be part of your continued growth and perhaps eventual transformation as well. Thank you so much, everyone, for joining us. See you on the next episode. Bye.